Buried warplanes. The American-made General Dynamics F-111 Aardvark is a medium-range supersonic fighter jet. It entered service with the United States Air Force in 1967 and with the Royal Australian Air Force in 1973. The U.S. Air Force began retiring its F-111s during the 90s, with plans to develop an F-111B variant. But the program was canceled, and the retired F-111s were replaced by the F-15E Strike Eagle and the B-1B Lancer. Australia continued to use its F-111s into the 2000s. The Royal Air Force retired its last operational unit at the end of 2010. Less than a year later, the Australian government buried 8 of the country's 15-jet fleet. History and aviation enthusiasts considered it a shame that the planes were disposed of this way, especially because the Queensland Air Museum in Caloundra had said it would be happy to take one of the jets and put it on display. In fact, the museum had been trying to acquire an F-111 for quite some time. Former pilot Cliff Robinson, who heads the museum, told the Courier Mail that he was optimistic about being able to get one of the jets at some point in the future. He and others pushed for changes that would help museums acquire and finance historic relics that they may not have the money to pay for up front. The campaign got the attention of Australian Member of Parliament Jason Clare, who stopped by to discuss the possibility with Robinson and other staff members. As of 2023, however, the only F-111 on display in Australia is at the Royal Air Force Museum located at the RAAF base at Point Cook in Victoria. Number 7. Repaired and repurposed. When the United States military abruptly withdrew its forces from Afghanistan in 2021, they left behind an estimated $7 billion worth of military equipment, including hundreds of vehicles. To avoid making them easily available to the Taliban, troops damaged the vehicles before leaving them behind, rendering them inoperable. The U.S. had given the equipment to the Afghan government throughout its 20-year presence in the country. As soon as American forces left Afghanistan, the Taliban launched an offensive against the Afghan leaders. With what seemed like minimal effort, the fundamentalist group swiftly toppled the government as it advanced from one region to the next. It wasn't long before the Taliban had regained control over most of the country. Resistance fighters retreated to the mountains while the once power-disposed Vice President, Amrullah Saleh, and resistance leader Ahmad Massoud fled to Tajikistan. In March 2023, Afghanistan's Ministry of Defense posted photos on Twitter of the abandoned military vehicles lined up neatly in rows. They appeared to be in great condition, and the collection appeared to consist mostly of Humvees and armored trucks. The Taliban revealed that its forces had repaired around 300 damaged vehicles, which it was clearly using to modernize its military. Retired Colonel Daniel Davis told News Nation that the vehicles probably won't last very long, even if they've been repaired and restored to operational status. In his own words, he said, "It's going to be a deteriorating asset no matter what." While it's understandably frustrating to see the equipment fall into the Taliban's possession, it would be unrealistic to blame the group for taking a finders keepers approach. Some might even argue that the situation adds to a growing list of consequences that came as a direct result of America's chaotic withdrawal from the country. Number 6. Abandoned Russian tanks. Within days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, photos of abandoned Russian military vehicles began appearing in the media. Tanks, amphibious vehicles, personnel transports, and infantry fighting vehicles appeared in Ukrainian fields, rivers, and bushes and along roadsides. Some of them were operational, while others were destroyed. The functioning vehicles may have been left behind due to technical or logistical failures, or because crews were captured. A senior U.S. defense official told the press that many of the Russian soldiers who were tasked with carrying out the invasion were young conscripts who had never seen combat. They may have been misinformed about the nature of their mission, and were quite possibly unaware that they were going into a war. The official also claimed that several large groups of Russian soldiers had quickly surrendered, in some cases without any resistance whatsoever. More than a year later, the war rages on, and the Ukrainian landscape remains littered with abandoned Russian military vehicles. Some have started to rust and have flat tires, while others are covered in graffiti, branches, and undergrowth. In one photo that appeared in the media in September 2022, 3 armored personnel carriers sat half-submerged in a river in Kharkiv. Some of the abandoned vehicles have been removed, but it's probably safe to assume that Ukraine's priority is to focus on winning the war and worry about cleaning up afterward. Number 5. $1 Million Point. During World War II, the United States military launched numerous attacks against Japan from the island of Espiritu Santo in the South Pacific. It's the largest island in the nation of Vanuatu and was home to an American military supply base, airfield, and naval harbor which were established after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. When the war ended, U.S. forces vacated the base. At the time, parts of Vanuatu were under British and French colonial control. As the American troops prepared to leave, they offered their surplus equipment for a very low price. But the French and British assumed that if they declined to buy the items, the Americans would leave them behind anyway, and the equipment would therefore come free of charge. But the Americans weren't about to let that happen. To prevent the supplies from falling into British or French hands, they dumped tons of equipment into the waters off the island's southern coast. The discarded collection included bulldozers, tractors, forklifts, jeeps, trucks, and more, amounting to millions of dollars worth of destroyed goods. Many saw the decision as wasteful and questioned why the U.S. military hadn't offered some of the items up to the local Vanuatu people. It was probably the least they could have done after setting up camp on the island for over 3 years, and most likely not giving anyone a say over the military's presence. Some experts have speculated that the Americans had ulterior motives beyond wanting to keep the equipment from the British and French. If they had taken the vehicles back to the U.S., the massive influx of low-cost machines would have possibly impacted the economy in damaging ways. Regardless of the reasons behind the decision, it admittedly seems frustrating to look on as the foreigners who stayed on your land drive one machine after another off a purpose-built ramp and into the water. According to researchers, official military records failed to accurately convey the magnitude of the dumping. It would actually be fair to say that officials wildly downplayed the number of vehicles and other items that were tossed into the ocean by describing the amount as modest. Once U.S. forces cleared out, locals salvaged what they could of the materials, but the vast majority of what was dumped remains at the site to this day. It's popular among divers, but for some, it's a painful reminder of the Americans' decision to pollute the environment and fail to consider helping the local population. What do you think the U.S. military should have done with the extra equipment? Let us know in the comments below. But first, be sure to subscribe. Number 4. Military Truck Graveyard. When it comes to getting rid of military vehicles, the solution is rarely cut and dry. Sometimes the surplus is auctioned off to civilian buyers. Other times, it's scrapped, sold to foreign governments, put in storage, or simply left to rot. In 2011, a YouTuber going by the name Grizzly Peak shared footage of an abandoned military truck graveyard deep in the California woods. The video showed him driving his pickup truck along a crude, overgrown dirt path that clearly hadn't been used in quite some time. At the property, there was a rundown shack that looked like it might collapse at any second and was filled with old junk. After walking through the ramshackle house and being incredibly lucky not to fall through any of the holes in the floor, the YouTuber turned his camera to a collection of vintage military trucks. A blue International Cargo Star, which most likely once operated as a military transport truck, had sat in a place for so long that it had sunk several inches into the ground. Another truck's registration sticker revealed that the vehicle had most likely been abandoned at the site more than 30 years earlier. The vehicles were in pitiful shape. The windows were shattered, the seat upholstery had been torn apart, most likely by a rodent, and they were definitely not in running condition. Unfortunately, the man who filmed the video didn't mention how or why the vehicles were left at the site. He probably didn't know himself, but it's probably safe to assume that someone once lived in the nearby cabin and collected the machines as a hobby after they retired from military service. Number 3. Downsizing and discarding. In 2020, the British Ministry of Defense announced that the Army was getting rid of 750 armored vehicles it had purchased to counter roadside bomb threats in Afghanistan. The fleet of blast-proof trucks, which consisted of at least 733 vehicles manufactured by the American company Force Protection, was the latest to be axed in an ongoing effort to downsize the British Army's fleet of protected patrol vehicles, or PPVs. By then, more than 2,800 other vehicles had already been taken out of service under the Land Environment Fleet Optimization Plan. To some, the sudden purge of nearly every single one of the military's counterinsurgency vehicles seemed foolish. But the Ministry of Defense was in a tight spot financially, and it was expensive to maintain the vehicles. Britain pulled out of Afghanistan in 2014 and held on to the equipment in case the Army was called to perform stabilization operations at some point in the future. But the vehicles went unused as they sat, collecting dust over the next 6 years. In the meantime, the British Army downsized its actual manpower, creating an even bigger surplus of the trucks. Officials failed to specify exactly how they plan to dispose of the vehicles, but that they plan to get rid of them over the next few years, and that some would likely be sold to foreign defense departments. Number 2. Naval Inactive Ship Maintenance Facilities. After the U.S. Navy decommissions a ship, it goes to one of 3 Naval Inactive Ship Maintenance Facilities, or NISMFs, which are located in Philadelphia, at the Pearl Harbor Base in Hawaii, and Washington's Puget Sound. These sites function as holding facilities for inactive ships while the Navy determines each vessel's fate. Some ships have been struck from the Naval Register, while others are still on it despite being taken out of service. Ships that have been stricken from the register will be discarded in one of several ways. It might be sold to a foreign country, donated as a memorial or museum, dismantled and scrapped, or cleaned of any dangerous materials and sunk as an artificial reef. Vessels that remain on the Naval Register are typically kept in storage and maintained so that they're ready to re-enter service if the need arises. Toward the end of the 90s, the Navy had nearly 200 inactive ships languishing at these facilities. A concerted effort to reduce the inactive fleets brought the number down to just 49 ships at the end of 2014. Today, the vast majority of ships moored at NISMFs have been stricken from the register and are waiting to either be scrapped or sold. Inactive ships are also stored at a handful of properties that are operated by the U.S. Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration, including in Northern California's Suisun Bay, a facility along the James River in Virginia, and in the port city of Beaumont, Texas. Number 1. Sierra Army Depot. Retired military equipment doesn't always get sold, thrown away, or scrapped. In many cases, it's put into storage for possible future use. One of the world's largest collections of armored vehicles can be found more than 4,000 feet above sea level at the Sierra Army Depot in Northern California. Located at the extreme eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, the sprawling 36,000-acre property was established in 1942 as a base for storing bombs and ammunition. The supplies were kept in hundreds of armored igloos. The site was chosen because it was remote, dry, and far enough from the Pacific coast to hopefully be safe in the event of a Japanese attack. Over the years, the military began storing vehicles at the property, where they're more resistant to rusting than usual due to the lack of humidity. Today, the Sierra Army Depot is home to thousands of tanks, trucks, armored personnel carriers, and other miscellaneous machines, which are parked neatly in rows across the seemingly never-ending stretch of land. The site is also home to more than 1,000 military buildings and has its own 10,000-foot runway. Staff members maintain the surplus vehicles at the depot so they can be put back into service if the need arises, which has certainly happened in the past. Since the 1960s, the depot has played a crucial role in shipping needed supplies overseas, including tactical vehicles, maintenance equipment, hospital supplies, and more. Number 8. The sinking of the SS Baron Gautsch. The 277-foot-long Austro-Hungarian passenger ship SS Baron Gautsch first hit the seas in 1908. At the outbreak of World War I on July 28, 1914, it entered military service under the Austro-Hungarian Navy. Over the next few weeks, the Baron Gautsch completed 4 voyages, ferrying supplies to troops in the coastal town of Kotor, which is now part of Montenegro, and evacuating civilians to various northern Adriatic ports. After delivering supplies to Kotor for a 5th time, the ship departed with 66 crew members and 240 passengers, including refugees from Bosnia and Herzegovina. While en route to Trieste in northeastern Italy, First Officer Joseph Lupus handed command of the vessel over to a relatively inexperienced second officer, Tenza, while the captain slept in his cabin. Tenza navigated the Baron Gautsch much further north than the military had ordered, and he remained on his wayward route even after several passengers warned him to change course. Records indicate that Tenza was aware of mines that the Austro-Hungarian Navy had placed in the area, yet he proceeded to navigate full speed ahead into a freshly laid minefield. A nearby mine layer tried to warn the Baron Gautsch, but the caution went unheeded. By the time Tenza became aware of the threat and began to steer toward the open sea, the ship was in the middle of a minefield. The vessel struck a mine, triggering an explosion on the port side that was followed by the explosion of the ship's boiler. Its oil supply also caught fire, burning many passengers alive. In the ensuing confusion, many people jumped overboard, while others scrambled into lifeboats. Passengers would later claim that crew members acted only in the interest of saving themselves. Nearby ships rescued 159 people, while 127 others tragically perished in the wreck. Number 7. Death along the Alpine front. There's no denying that trench warfare along the Western Front was unimaginably hellish. The conditions along the mountainous border between Italy and Austria-Hungary, known as the Italian Front or the Alpine Front, were much different, but arguably just as torturous. At the beginning of the war, the Kingdom of Italy sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but refused to commit military support and had its eye on several Austro-Hungarian-controlled territories. After being promised some of these territories by the British, Italy switched sides and declared war on Austria-Hungary. Outnumbering the enemy by as many as 3-1, Italian troops expected to capture Austro-Hungarian strongholds in the Alps with relative ease, but the Austro-Hungarians were better positioned and well fortified, leading to a prolonged period of fierce mountain warfare between the two countries. Getting men and supplies into place often required scaling steep cliffs into a brutally frigid high-altitude environment, where temperatures were known to dip as low as minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. During a 3.5-year period of fighting in the Italian Alps, known as the White War, more than 2/3 of the estimated 150,000 casualties were caused by things other than actual combat, including avalanches, frostbite, landslides, illness, and other effects of the unforgiving weather. Factoring in casualties that occurred elsewhere along the Italian front throughout the war, the death toll is estimated at around 1 million. Much like the trench warfare on the ground, the fighting in the Alps reached an agonizing stalemate. Soldiers languished in cramped, crude shelters while they waited for the war to end. The moment they learned the conflict was over, they eagerly abandoned their posts and never looked back. Number 6. The Serbian Campaign. On July 28, 1914, at the very beginning of World War I, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The main goal was to punish the country for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at the hands of a teenager and Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. While the first battle of the campaign saw a Serbian victory against Austro-Hungarian forces, it was followed by a second battle that ended in a deadlock. The Austro-Hungarians captured Belgrade during a third offensive, but the Serbs recaptured the city and went on to enjoy a 9-month break from Austrian advances. During this period, they attempted to rebuild and resupply the ailing Serbian army, but these efforts largely failed. As a result, the Serbs were woefully unprepared when the Germans and Austro-Hungarians attacked Belgrade in October 1915, marking the beginning of the Second Serbian Campaign. They attempted to fight back against the invading forces, but within 2 days, any and all resistance was crushed. A week later, the Bulgarian army launched a 2-pronged attack on Serbia. It was victorious on both ends. By then, Britain and France had discussed the possibility of sending forces to Serbia, but they took long enough to act for much of the damage to be done before reinforcements arrived. 2 partial Allied divisions were sent in, only to be halted by the Bulgarians. In the meantime, Serbian commander Marshal Radomir Putnik offered a full retreat through Montenegro and into Albania. Faced with poor roads, terrible weather, disease, and a severe shortage of food and supplies, many of the fleeing soldiers and the tens of thousands of civilian refugees who joined them died from hunger, disease, and attacks. An estimated 155,000 Serbs, most of whom were soldiers, survived the trek, which came to be known as the Great Retreat. While the exact number of Serbian casualties is unknown, it's believed that around 1 million Serbian soldiers and civilians died throughout World War I, amounting to roughly a quarter of the country's population and up to 57% of its male population. As many as 500,000 children were left orphaned. Assuming these estimates are correct, it means that Serbia suffered more than any other country involved in the war. Number 5. Armenian Genocide. In what some have called the first genocide of the 20th century, Armenian Christians living in the Ottoman Empire were systematically annihilated and deported between the springs of 1915 and the fall of 1916. The persecution and mass killing were carried out by Ottoman authorities, also known as the Young Turks, with the goal of solidifying Muslim Turkish dominance in central and eastern Anatolia. At the beginning of World War I, the Turks sided with Germany. Turkish military leaders quickly adopted the mentality that Armenians might support the Allies if they believed an Allied victory might secure their independence. Between this preemptive labeling of Armenians as traitors and the ensuing efforts among Armenians to support the Russian army in its fight against the Turks, Ottoman authorities concluded that the only answer was to rid the Armenian presence from the region. The genocide officially began on April 24, 1915, with the arrest and execution of several hundred Armenian intellectuals. Afterward, authorities began forcing Armenians out of their homes and on death marches across the Mesopotamian desert. In the meantime, local massacres continued. Out of the total population of 1.5 million Armenian Christians, somewhere between 664,000 and 1.2 million were killed in the genocide, while many others were forcibly removed from the country. Many victims died in massacres, while others succumbed to starvation, dehydration, exposure, and disease while being deported. To this day, the Turkish government denies that a genocide occurred, instead arguing that the Armenians were an enemy force that had to be eliminated. Number 4. The Halifax Explosion. Shortly after departing from Nova Scotia for France with a supply of explosives on December 6, 1917, the French cargo ship MS Mont Blanc collided with the Norwegian vessel SS Imo in Halifax Harbor. The Mont Blanc erupted into flames and ran aground as a crowd gathered on the shore to watch the disaster unfold, unaware that the ship was laden with highly combustible materials. Around 20 minutes after the collision, the fire reached the nearly 3,000 tons of explosives in the vessel's cargo hold, triggering a massive blast. At least 1,782 people died, many of them instantly. At least 6,000 others were injured, and an estimated 9,000 people were left homeless. The explosion toppled nearly every building within a half-mile radius, including the entire community of Richmond, set entire blocks on fire in other neighborhoods, and caused a tsunami, which wiped out an entire Mi'kmaq First Nation community. To make matters worse, a blizzard struck later that night, halting rescue trains and impeding other relief efforts. At the time, it was the largest man-made explosion in history, releasing the equivalent energy of roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT. The force of the blast was so great that the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, famously known as the father of the atomic bomb, studied the incident years later as part of an attempt to estimate the potential damage of the nuclear weapons he was working to develop. An initial inquiry ruled that the Mont Blanc was solely to blame for the tragedy, but the decision was appealed, and a subsequent verdict blamed both ships. Number 3. The East African Campaign. People tend to forget that World War I extended beyond the confines of Europe, despite its very name indicating that it was a global affair. In fact, it was during the First World War that the largest armed conflict on African soil in recorded history took place. Known as the East African Campaign, this 4-year period encompassed a series of battles, naval engagements, raids, and guerrilla maneuvers undertaken against German East Africa by British, Belgian, and Portuguese forces. The fighting occurred over a 750,000 square mile area, which is mostly made up of modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. An estimated 150,000 Allied troops, assisted by 600,000 African bearers, attempted to defeat a German force of no more than 25,000. Sounds easy, right? Not exactly, as the Allies learned. Led by Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, the Germans were effectively cut off. Defeat was inevitable, but Lettow-Vorbeck wanted the Allied victory to come at as high of a cost as possible. He achieved his goal through a combination of ingenuity, endurance, and the ruthless exploitation of colonial subjects, which enabled the commander to hold out until the very end of the war. Combat deaths numbered in the tens of thousands, while at least 350,000 civilians lost their lives. In addition to being dragged directly into the fighting, people perished from disease, including the 1918 flu pandemic, and died in war-related famines. Even after surrendering, Lettow-Vorbeck was received as a hero among Germans, and he welcomed the treatment. Like most other German colonial officers, he never expressed remorse for the civilian losses that came with the East African Campaign. Number 2. Devastation in Romania. In 1916, after remaining neutral for the first 2 years of the war, the Kingdom of Romania was given an ultimatum: join the Allied effort, also known as the Entente, now or never. King Ferdinand I committed the country's support to the Allies. It seemed like an ideal arrangement. The Allies hoped to cut rail communications between Germany and Turkey and to disrupt Germany's oil supply, which had come largely from Romania up until that point in the conflict. Romania hoped to capture Transylvania from Hungary. To bolster the country's military strength, the Allies loaned money, sent a training mission, and promised munitions and manpower. Romania initially saw some successes against the Central Powers, but by the end of 1916, the country's forces were losing grip on its territory and suffering major setbacks. The situation grew even more dire when Russia withdrew from the war following the October Revolution in 1917. By May of 1918, Romania was almost entirely surrounded by the Central Powers. With a perceived lack of other options, the country's parliament signed the Treaty of Bucharest, which saw the loss of territories to Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria, as well as a requirement to lease its oil reserves to Germany for 99 years. King Ferdinand I refused to sign the treaty. Just one day before the German armistice that ended the war, Romania renounced the treaty and rejoined the conflict. Despite this last-minute success, the country was left ravaged by the war, losing an estimated 8% of its population in just 2 years of fighting. Number 1. The influenza pandemic. Commonly known as the Spanish flu, the Great Influenza Pandemic began in March 1918 in Kansas. Marked by unusually severe symptoms, the disease, later identified as the H1N1 flu strain, infected around 500 million people, nearly a third of the global population, within a 2-year period. The virus would have undoubtedly traveled far and wide no matter what, but its spread was likely exacerbated by the departure of soldiers from Camp Funston in eastern Kansas. According to researchers from the University of Kansas, hundreds of cases and many deaths had already been recorded at the base during the earliest stage of the pandemic, making it virtually certain that young men took it overseas with them when they went off to war. By April of 1918, the flu had spread to France via American soldiers, and by August, it had a worldwide presence. It's impossible to say for certain, but experts estimate that around 40% of soldiers on the Western Front caught the disease, and around 2% died from it. According to U.S. Army statistics, 24,664 of 791,907 Army hospital admissions for influenza resulted in death, amounting to a roughly 3% mortality rate. It may not sound like a lot, but it's roughly half the number of American combat deaths that occurred throughout the war, and the virus had an undeniable impact on the conflict. It may have even shortened the war by weakening the Germans physically and causing their morale to plummet, putting the Allies in an advantageous position to overrun them.
7. The Japanese invasion of Alaska. World War II was a disastrous global conflict that involved many regions and theaters of war. One of the lesser-known but significant fronts was the Aleutian Islands Campaign, which was the only Japanese invasion of U.S. territory during the war. The fighting lasted from June 1942 to August 1943 and involved a series of battles between the US, Canada, and Japan. The Aleutian Islands are a chain of volcanic islands that extend from Alaska toward Russia. They have a small population, mainly consisting of native Aleuts and American military personnel. Japan targeted the islands as part of its strategy to distract American attention from the Pacific Theater. Japan also hoped to stop a possible attack on Japan from the north by its enemies. Japan officially launched its invasion by bombing Dutch Harbor, a naval base and port on Unalaska Island, on June 3rd and 4th, 1942. The attacks caused some major damage and casualties, but failed to destroy the base. Japan then landed troops on the islands of Kiska and Attu, near the western end of the Aleutians, on June 6th and 7th. The Japanese faced little resistance since Kiska had only a small naval weather station, and Attu had only a few villagers. The forces captured about 50 Americans and either killed or enslaved many Aleuts. The US and Canada responded by quickly launching a counteroffensive to retake the islands. They faced many challenges like harsh weather, rugged terrain, supply shortages, and more. The campaign lasted for over a year and involved naval, air, and ground operations. The Battle of Attu was fought from May 11th to May 30th, 1943. It was the only land battle that took place in North America during World War II. The U.S. forces outnumbered the Japanese defenders, but experienced heavy losses due to the terrain and ambushes. The battle ended with the annihilation of the Japanese garrison of 2,600 men. The Battle of Kiska was later fought from August 15th to August 24th, 1943. It was a bloodless battle since the Japanese evacuated their troops on July 28th. But the US and Canadian forces did not know this and showed up expecting a fight. They suffered over 300 casualties due to friendly fire, mines, booby traps, and simple accidents. 6. The Night Witches of World War II. One of the most remarkable stories out of World War II covers the Night Witches, a group of female pilots who conducted bombing missions for the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. They were the first women in history to engage in combat as military aviators, and they earned their nickname from the fear they put into their enemies. The Night Witches were first formed by Major Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet pilot who convinced Joseph Stalin to let women join the Air Force. She received thousands of letters from women who wanted to fight, many of whom had lost their loved ones or homes to the German invasion. Raskova organized 3 female regiments: a fighter squad, a bomber squad, and a night bomber squad. The last was the most famous and successful out of the 3. The Night Bomber Regiment, or the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, consisted of about 400 women, ranging from 17 to 26 years old. They flew outdated biplanes made of wood and canvas, which were originally used for crop dusting and training. These planes had no radar equipment, radio, or parachutes, and could only carry 2 bombs at a time. They were slow, noisy, and extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. But the Night Witches turned these disadvantages into positives. They flew under the cover of darkness, using the moon and stars to navigate. They flew in groups of 3. 2 would act as decoys and draw enemy fire, while the 3rd would turn off her engine and glide silently over the target. They would then drop their bombs and turn their engines back on, creating a loud whooshing sound that resembled a witch's broom. This sound terrified German soldiers, who couldn't see them coming until it was too late. The Night Witches flew over 23,000 sorties and dropped 3,000 tons, 2,721 metric tons, of bombs on Nazi targets. They attacked military bases, supply lines, airfields, factories, bridges, and more. They faced fierce resistance from anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes, as well as harsh weather conditions. The women suffered casualties and losses, but never gave up. They were eventually awarded medals and honors for their bravery. The Night Witches were a remarkable example of courage, determination, and patriotism. They proved that women could be just as effective as men in combat, and they inspired many others to join the war effort. They were a nightmare for Nazis, but a source of pride and admiration for their nation. 5. The Ghost Army. The Ghost Army was a secret unit from the United States during World War II that specialized in tactical deception. Its official name was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and it had about 1,100 soldiers, many of whom were artists, actors, engineers, and designers. Their mission was to create illusions of large Allied forces to confuse the enemy while real troops moved elsewhere. The Ghost Army used multiple techniques to create their tricks, like inflatable tanks, trucks, and planes that looked realistic from far away, sound trucks that broadcasted the sounds of tanks, guns, and troops, fake radio transmissions that mimicked real units, and actors who impersonated high-ranking officers and spread fake information. The Ghost Army also used camouflage, props, and art to disguise their equipment and locations. They arrived in Europe in May 1944, not long before D-Day, and participated in over 20 deception operations in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany until the end of the war. Some of their notable achievements include tricking the Germans about the size and location of the Allied forces in Normandy, diverting Nazi attention away from the real crossings of the Seine and the Rhine, and making a fake army group near the German border to draw enemy troops away from the Battle of the Bulge. The Ghost Army's activities were kept secret for about 50 years after the war, until they were finally declassified in 1996. The unit was then credited with saving thousands of Allied lives by creating confusion among the German commanders. The Ghost Army was also a source of artistic and creative expression for its soldiers, who produced many paintings, sketches, and photographs of their experiences. In 2013, a documentary titled The Ghost Army was released to tell their story. The Congressional Gold Medal was given to Ghost Army personnel in February 2022, thanks to President Biden's signing of a bill that recognized their distinguished service in carrying out deception operations during World War II. The medal is the highest civilian honor bestowed by Congress and recognizes the extreme courage, creativity, and innovation of the Ghost Army. Have you ever heard of the Ghost Army? Let us know in the comments down below. If you like the video so far, be sure to subscribe. 4. The St. Nazaire Raid. The St. Nazaire Raid, or Operation Chariot, was a British attack on the French German-occupied port of St. Nazaire during World War II. The raid happened on the night of March 28, 1942, and involved Royal Navy ships and commandos. The main goal was to destroy the Normandy dry dock, which was the only facility capable of repairing the German battleship Tirpitz. The raid was put together by Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, the chief of the combined operations, who was supported by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The plan involved ramming an old destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, filled with explosives, into the dock gates while commandos landed from small boats to destroy other targets and create distractions. The raiders expected heavy resistance from German defenders, who had guns, searchlights, and patrol boats in the harbor. The raid was ultimately a success, but this came at a high cost. Campbelltown managed to reach the dry dock gates, which exploded later that morning, rendering the dock unusable for the remainder of the war. The commandos inflicted significant damage on other installations and equipment, but faced opposition and had difficulty going back to their boats. Only 228 of the raid's 622 participants made it back to Britain in one piece. The rest were killed or captured. The St. Nazaire Raid was one of the most daring and heroic operations in all of World War II. It demonstrated the courage and skill of British forces and their willingness to tackle risky missions against overwhelming odds. It also stopped the Tirpitz from threatening the Atlantic convoys that supplied Britain and its close allies. 3. Operation Halyard. Operation Halyard was a successful Allied airlift mission behind enemy lines during World War II. It was the largest rescue operation by American pilots in history, saving over 500 people. It was carried out by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor of the CIA, and the Chetniks, a Serbian resistance movement led by General Dra Mihailović. The Chetniks were loyal to the exiled Yugoslav king and fought ferociously against the Nazis, as well as Tito's Partisans, a communist-led rival resistance group. They helped hundreds of Allied airmen who had been shot down in Serbia and parts of Croatia. The airmen were hidden, fed, and protected by local villagers and the Chetniks, until they could safely be airlifted out by the United States 15th Air Force. The pilots came from multiple countries, including the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Poland. The operation lasted from July to December 1944. It involved building a makeshift airstrip near Pranjani, a village in central Serbia, where C-47 transport planes could land and take off even under enemy fire. The OSS team, led by Lieutenant George Musulin, a Serbian-American, coordinated the rescue efforts with the Chetniks and the 15th Air Force. The operation was kept secret from practically everyone except those directly involved. Operation Halyard was a remarkable feat of courage and cooperation between the Americans and Serbs. It saved hundreds of lives and improved the friendship between the two nations. It also demonstrated the bravery of the Chetniks and their leader, Mihailović, who was later killed by Tito's regime after the war. 2. The Secret Life of Vera Atkins. She was the woman behind hundreds of secret agents who fought Nazis in France, the mastermind who cracked coded messages that stumped everyone else, the fearless investigator who tracked down her missing comrades and brought their killers to justice. She was Vera Atkins, one of the most remarkable and influential women out of World War II. Vera Atkins was born in Romania back in 1908 to a wealthy Jewish family. She studied in Paris and London and became involved with British intelligence before the war started. In 1973, she moved to England as the political situation in Europe crumbled. When Germany officially invaded France in 1940, she joined up with the Special Operations Executive, SOE, a secret organization that supported resistance movements across Europe. Atkins rose to the head intelligence officer of the SOE's France section. second only to her boss, Colonel Maurice Buckmaster. She was responsible for recruiting, training, and planning operations for hundreds of agents who infiltrated France to sabotage German installations, gather intelligence, and organize resistance groups. She also deciphered coded German messages that no one else seemed able to crack. Atkins was known for being tough and respectful of her agents. She showed little emotion, but was committed to their welfare. She maintained contact with them and often sent them personal gifts and messages of encouragement. She also risked her life multiple times to meet them in France and help them escape danger. After the war, Atkins went on a personal mission to discover the fate of 118 missing agents, most of whom had been captured and killed by the Gestapo. She traveled across Europe and interviewed witnesses and survivors to uncover the truth. She also testified at war crime trials and helped bring some of the Nazi criminals to justice. Atkins was awarded honors for her service, including the Croix de Guerre from France in 1948 and the Legion of Honor in 1995. She also inspired the fictional character of M, the spy master in James Bond, created by Ian Fleming. Atkins died back in 2000 at the old age of 92. She is remembered as one of the most remarkable and influential women in all of World War II. 1. The Doolittle Raid. The Doolittle Raid was an unexpected air attack by the U.S. Army Air Forces on Tokyo and other Japanese cities on April 18, 1942. It was the first American air mission to hit the Japanese mainland and was a retaliation for Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a well-known engineer and pilot, organized the operation. He and 79 other airmen flew 16 B-25B Mitchell medium bombers from the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier USS Hornet. They had no fighter escorts and faced both enemy fire and bad weather. After dropping their bombs on military and industrial targets, they flew westward to land in China or the Soviet Union. The raid caused minor physical damage, but had incredible psychological effects. It boosted American morale and shook the confidence of the Japanese. It also provoked Japan to launch an attack on Midway Island, which was a decisive defeat for their navy. The raid also had severe consequences for China, since Japan retaliated by killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers. Out of the 80 raiders, only 69 survived the mission. 3 were killed, 8 were captured by Japan, and 1 died in captivity. Doolittle and many of his men received medals for their bravery and skill. Thanks for watching. Those were just a few of the countless incredible stories from World War II. Let us know which one was your favorite. Before you go, be sure to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.